Welcome to another episode of Jamming with Jason. Hey, today we're going to talk about poetry and music. And of course, music, as we think about it, is usually just poetic lyrics that are sung to a particular frequency. And we're going to talk about the power of poetry. I'm actually going to read some poetry to you and share one of my favorite poems when I was younger. And whether you may realize it or not, I'm actually a poet as well. I've written quite a bit of poetry over my life. And so we'll share some of that with you as well. And again, we're using this as a way to learn some different things. And so with that, we're going to roll that episode now. All right. For those of you that may be listening to this live video, you're like, hold it. You said jamming with Jason. What's going on? Well, I've decided that sometimes I might actually record some of my podcast episodes as live videos because it might be kind of fun, right? So here we go. So here's one today that's entitled Sam McGee and Walking the Streets Alone. And because I wanted to talk about poetry, there's been some things just kind of coming into my stream of consciousness around poetry. Remembered one of the poems that I really loved as a child that my mother used to read to me. In fact, I can still quote most of the poem by heart, which again, as I was thinking about that, was kind of an interesting thing for me to kind of sit with and ponder and recapitulate a little bit, and reminded me just how much power there is in poetry and in music. Right. And so a lot of times, I'm sure you can probably remember a lot of different song lyrics. You just start singing the song and you have no idea how you remember the lyrics, maybe from 20, 30, 40 years ago. But those things kind of get encoded into your being. And so that's one of the reasons poetry and rhyming and music, right, when we do it that way, is really a great way for us to be able to learn, but it's also a great way for us to remember, to encapsulate some of our memories and make them easier to access. And it's also a way for us to change our state of consciousness and even our emotions. And so I wanted to get in and kind of talk about that today. Okay. So, the title again is Sam McGee and Walking the Streets Alone. Why? Well, I wrote a book back in 2010. It was a book of poetry that I had written between 1990 and 2010. So it was some things, for me during my early college years up until my first marriage and having 4 children, and some of the different experiences and things that I was inspired to write at that point. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you today as well. And, again, because this is recorded in a live format, if you're on with me live, you can put stuff in the comments if you want to kind of have a little discussion along the way and actually kind of get incorporated into kind of having a two-way conversation in this video as well. So here we go. So let's get started. So I wanted to bring up, and I'm gonna show you the book. So this book, The Collected Poems of Robert Service, is a book that sat on our bookshelf as I was a child growing up. It was one of the books that I kept being drawn to. It has like a blue and yellow kind of cover to it, and I don't know why, but for some reason this book kind of spoke to me when I was a child. And it was my mother's book. I'm gonna go ahead and take the jacket cover off so I don't make a big old mess here. But it was a book that was my mother's, and I don't know the story behind it. My maternal grandfather moved up to Alaska, and I know that Robert Service was, if I remember correctly, was a Canadian poet. So a lot of his stuff was kind of about the Canadian North Country up into Alaska. So I don't know if that was kind of a draw for my father-in-law and maybe my grandfather, and maybe he gave this to my mother as a gift, or if it was just something that my mother was called to. I don't know. But I remember as a kid, and some of my best memories was my mom reading to me. My mom was a huge reader. She always had a book that she was reading. And I remember sometimes she would sit down with me and read to me. And sometimes she would read poems from Robert Service to me. And one poem that I really, for some reason, always stuck with me, always, for some reason, kind of meant a lot to me. I found it kind of funny. I don't know what it exactly was, but it was called The Cremation of Sam McGee. And so, again, that poem came into my awareness this last week or so, and I wanted to share it with you. So I'm going to go through and read the poem. And again, I haven't read the poem, I just for a while. Okay. But I'm going to go through and read it and kind of talk about it a little bit, see what things maybe come back into my remembrance. But like I said, I think it's a great poem, right? And some poems kind of tell a story similar to, some songs, especially ballads and a lot of country music, really kind of tell a story. And so that's what this poem actually does, is it really kind of tells a story of this man named Sam McGee. Okay. And so I'm going to go ahead and read it now. And then we're going to talk about it a little bit. Okay. So again, it's called The Cremation of Sam McGee. And this is from the book, The Collected Poems of Robert Service. So it says, there are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic trails have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The northern lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge, I cremated Sam McGee. Now, Sam McGee was from Tennessee, where the cotton blooms and blows. Why he left his home in the South to roam round the pole, God only knows. He was always cold, but the land of gold seemed to hold him like a spell, though he'd often say in his homely way that he'd sooner live in hell. On a Christmas day, we were mushing our way over the Dawson Trail. Talk of your cold through the parka's fold, it stabbed like a driven nail. If our eyes we'd closed, then the lashes froze till sometimes we couldn't see. It wasn't much fun, but the only one to whimper was Sam McGee. And that very night, as we lay packed tight in our robes beneath the snow, and the dogs were fed and the stars o'erhead were dancing heel and toe, he turned to me and, Cap, says he, I'll cash in this trip, I guess. And if I do, I'm asking that you won't refuse my last request. Well, he seemed so low that I couldn't say no. Then he says with a sort of moan, it's this cursed cold, and it's got right hold till I'm chilled clean through the bone. Yet tain't being dead, it's my awful dread of the icy grave that pains. So I want you to swear that foul or fair, you'll cremate my last remains. A pal's last need is a thing indeed to heed, so I swore I would not fail. And we started on at the streak of dawn, but God, he looked so ghastly pale. He crouched on the sleigh, and he raved all day of his home in Tennessee. And before nightfall, a corpse was all that was left of Sam McGee. There wasn't a breath in that land of death, and I hurried horror-driven, with a corpse half hid that I couldn't get rid because of a promise given. It was lashed to the sleigh, and it seemed to say, you may tax your brawn and brains, but you promised true, and it's up to you to cremate those last remains. Now, a promise made is a debt unpaid, and the trail has its own stern code. In the days to come, though my lips were dumb, in my heart how I cursed that load. In the long, long night by the lone fore light, while the huskies round in a ring howled out their woes to the homeless snows, oh God, how I loathed that thing. And every day that quiet clay seemed to heavier and heavier grow. And on I went, though the dogs were spent and the grub was getting low. The trail was bad, and I felt half mad, but I swore I would not give in. And I'd often sting to the hateful thing, and it hearkened with a grin. Till I came to the marge of Lake Labarge, and a derelict there lay. It was jammed in the ice, but I saw in a trice it was called Alice May. And I looked at him, and I thought a bit, and I looked at my frozen chum. Then here said I, with a sudden cry, is my crematorium. Some planks I tore from the cabin floor, and I lit the boiler fire. Some coal I found that was lying around, and I heaped the fuel higher. The flames just soared, and the furnace roared, such a blaze you seldom see. And I burrowed a hole in the glowing coal, and I stuffed in Sam McGee. Then I made a hike, for I did not like to hear him sizzle so. And the heavens scowled, and the huskies howled, and the wind began to blow. It was icy cold, but the hot sweat rolled down my cheeks, and I don't know why. And the greasy smoke in an inky cloak went streaking down the sky. I do not know how long in the snow I wrestled with grisly fear, but the stars came out and they danced about ere again I ventured near. I was sick with dread, but I bravely said, I'll just take a peek inside. I guess he's cooked, and it's time I looked. Then the door I opened wide. And there sat Sam looking cool and calm in the heart of the furnace roar. And he wore a smile you could see a mile, and he said, Please close that door. It's fine in here, but I greatly fear you'll let in the cold and storm. Since I left Plumtree down in Tennessee, it's the first time I've been warm. There are strange things done in the midnight sun by the men who moil for gold. The Arctic Trail have their secret tales that would make your blood run cold. The Northern Lights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever did see was that night on the marge of Lake Labarge, I cremated Sam McGee. So that is the cremation of Sam McGee. Now, as I said, I haven't read that poem in many, many years. I was always drawn to it. I don't know why. As I read it now, it means some different things to me than it probably did when I was a little boy, when my mom read it to me. There's certain parts of it that I always found funny. He goes back and he opens the door, and there's Sam talking to him. Hey, please close the door. It's nice and warm in here, right? But there's a lot of imagery in it, and I think a lot of lessons for us to learn as well, right? So again, Sam, for whatever reason, decided to move from Tennessee, where it was nice and warm, up into the Arctic to find gold, right? And a lot of people did that back in the time. They would leave their home and travel a long ways away in search of employment, in search of riches, if they were in the gold rush, let's say, right? And so that is a story that many of us have followed, right? Most of us have left our home somewhere to go for work, to travel, to do something. And many of us long for our home, right? Even though, a lot of times I was just talking with a friend the other day who, grew up back east, moved out to California, and now, she's longing for her home back east, where she said, I never thought I would ever go back, but now I'm longing to go back, right? And so sometimes that happens to all of us, right? That's a common thing that may happen. You may have a homesickness to go back. You're out on a long journey. You're doing your hero's journey, and you want to be able to go back home at some point once you get through all of the trials and tribulations. So that's a life lesson for all of us. The part where, again, Sam, pretty much says, hey, I'm going to cash in my chips. I think it's about time for me to go. But if I do, will you do me, you're my friend, will you do me a favor, right? And how much of the time, again, right, a pal's last need from a friend indeed, right, is a serious thing to do. And, again, people in our lives who, we provide service to, we do things for, right? He made a promise to Sam that he would cremate him. He wouldn't just go bury him in the snow somewhere, but that he would actually cremate him. And it became a burden, right, to the man who was writing this poem, or the protagonist in the poem. It got heavier and heavier, and it was hideous. And here he is driving around in his sleigh, right? So it was a dog sled, right? Dogs with a sled, and there's this dead guy attached to it, which is heavy. And again, I'm sure every time he looked down and saw Sam, it got heavier and heavier for him, right? And so a lot of times when we make a promise, when we do things like this, sometimes it gets hard. And a lot of us would rather just cut the ropes and throw Sam off and say, hey, he's dead anyway, who cares, right? But the person in the poem, right, had integrity. He had promised to do something, and he chose to fulfill that promise, even though he had to drag him around for what sounds like a week or two to find a good place where he could actually cremate him, right? But he was true to his word, right? And so again, for all of us, are we true to our word? Do we keep our promises to others? Do we keep our promises to ourselves? That's it's a good lesson for all of us to think about and make sure, what we're doing. And again, I just find that poem interesting. And again, the point where he asked for the favor, that Sam asked for the favor. As I've gotten older and I've watched people around me who transition out of this physical life, the closer we get to death, right, we start to kind of realize it, and we start to long for our home. We start to long for people who have passed before us. And again, that's a normal part of life, and a reminder to us that's also included in that poem. Now, as a little kid, I probably liked it because it said God and hell and some different words like that. And I was kind of like, right? But now, as a much older man, it means so much more to me. Like I said, as I read it, because there are often queer sights that we see and weird things that we see, right? And the older you get and the more experience you have, the more you see things you're just like, what just happened, right? And so I see that as well. And as I said, from the beginning, for some reason, I memorized kind of the prelude and the postlude to it. The Northern Sights have seen queer sights, but the queerest they ever have seen was that night on the barge of Lake Lamarge when I cremated Sam McGee, right? I've remembered that. I've known that for 40, 45 years. Why? I don't know, but there's power in poetry. And so the rhythmic nature of poetry, the rhyming sequence of poetry allows us to remember these things easier. And so it's a reminder for us too that we can use music, we can use poetry and other things like that to remember things more often. In fact, I'm going to be doing another episode. I'll probably record it pretty much right after this one, that talks more about that and how a lot of times, music and things like that actually also encapsulate certain memories for us. So as an example, right, as I sit here and read this poem now, even though my mother transitioned about 20 years ago, I can still feel myself as a little boy sitting on her lap or sitting next to her on the couch as she's reading that to me. And I feel her love, right? I feel her love. I feel the security, the caring, the closeness that I had with my mother most of my life, but especially those particular experiences when I was little, when she would read to me. And so again, for me, it opens up all kinds of other emotions for me as well, and helps me to remember and live in that state of consciousness, that state of emotion of love, of gratitude for my mother. Like I said, even though she's been gone for a long time, I can still sit in gratitude and love for her, and I can still communicate with her, right? And I can still praise her and honor her, right? In fact, by sharing this poem today, in a way, I'm honoring and remembering my mother, right? And all of the good things. I'm not going to remember all the bad things that happened, but I'm going to remember her love for me and my love for her. In fact, as I was reading it, hopefully you couldn't tell, but I started to get emotional in a couple of points, right? Which again, if you've been listening to me for a long time, sometimes I'll start crying on here or getting emotional when I'm singing songs to you, right? And it's a good thing. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's just what is, right? So that is the cremation of Sam McGee. Now, I told you at the start too, I published this little tiny book called I Walked the Streets Alone, back in, again, it was poems from 1990 to 2010. So it was somewhere around, well, let's see, copyright is 2011. So there you go. So I did it the year after. Now, in this, what's interesting is there's a lot of different poems in this book that I wrote. And of course, I am a different person today than I was when I wrote them. And some of the poems that I created, I still really like. Others, I might not, where they bring up certain emotions or certain experiences that I've left behind and I no longer want to go and visit, right? But I think it brings up an interesting point of, anything that we are creating. So again, if you take a look at, music and a lot of the bands and other things that are out there, we'll take the Beatles, because they were one, obviously, where you could really see an evolution in their music from the start until they broke up. And I'm sure, some of the doo-woppy kind of, skiffle band kind of stuff that they did very early on, they wouldn't necessarily consider it their favorite, or they wouldn't consider it, a great creation, because again, as they grew musically, they created a lot more complex music, right? So a lot of their music at the beginning was very repetitive, just a few chords, and a lot of the lyrics kind of repeated themselves over and over again. So from a complexity standpoint, not that complex of music, not that hard to write per se, okay? But they didn't throw it out, and they don't sit there and because that music means something to different people, right? I mean, look at all the Beatle hysteria and the millions and millions of people all over the world that, especially some of their very early work that they did, you can still remember those lyrics. You can still, feel it. Even though that music was written now, this would be 60 some years ago, right? But I think so where I'm kind of going with it is, I'm still proud of what I created. Some of the things that I might have said at the time, maybe I no longer believe. Or, maybe they were because of a relationship I was in, or some particular experience that I had at that point that led me to create that piece of poetry. And so I created it, and it's out in the world now, right? It means something to me necessarily, or there was a reason why I might have read it or wrote it to begin with. But really, once something is created like art and it's let out into the world, now it's up to you, right? What does it mean to you? Does it mean something for you? Is it important for you, right? Do you resonate with it? Does it help you in some way, right? And so again, as I said, as I was going back and reading it, I don't need to feel embarrassed or anything about that. I don't need to feel like, hey, maybe if I don't believe some of the things that I said, 40 years ago, it's okay, right? I don't have to continue to believe the same things my whole life. But I wanted to kind of go through, share that with you, and actually kind of share maybe a couple of the poems from it, and just kind of, because there's power in it. Maybe you get to know me a little bit better, and maybe some of these actually will resonate with you as well and be helpful for you. And so again, on this, I did a couple of different versions of the book, but this one, has a picture of a big building in kind of a downtown area, and it's I Walk the Streets Alone. And so, if I go to that, where's that? There we go. To that poem. Let me just read it to you. And then maybe I'll talk a little bit about it. Okay. So it's called I Walk the Streets Alone. I walk the streets alone, the hustle and bustle, the flashing lights, the cars, and cigarette smoke, the mindless babbling of derelicts, the aroma of ethnic and not so ethnic foods. I walk the streets alone, no loved one by my side, no words I speak, no smiles engaged, no smell of fresh cut grass, no ray of sunshine warming my skin. I walked the streets alone and stopped to sit by the river. The evening sky is dark and calm, illuminated by the building lights. All is calm and tranquil, majestic structures reaching heavenward, soothing my soul. I walk the streets alone, I do not mind the solitude. So there was a big, part of my career early on, especially where I was traveling a lot, right? So even though I was at the time when I wrote this, when did I even write that? Somewhere in 2006. Okay, 2006. Best of my recollection. So almost 20 years ago. Well, at that time, I was traveling the world a lot. Okay, I was flying all over the world to a lot of times where I would be in very large cities, right, in the downtown business areas, because that's where I was doing my work. And so you have these huge, majestic skyscrapers going heavenward. And I remember, I grew up in a smaller town in Idaho. In fact, we didn't even live in town. We lived 5 miles outside of a 2,000 person town, which was about 5 or 10 miles away from a town at the time that had about 100,000 people, right? So I grew up out away pretty much from everybody. And so I've always really enjoyed city and the urban views, right? But I didn't grow up with that. I wasn't used to it growing up. And so in that poem, it shares a little bit about kind of my learning as I am kind of expanding or branching out from this little country boy, right, who's going to the big city. And one of the things that always kind of perplexed me, or that I found was interesting or different, is that in the middle of the day, there's shadows everywhere. You don't get the sun. So if you're in a deeply urban area with large buildings, you can walk around in the middle of the day and the sun doesn't actually land on you, right? Because the sun is blocked by all of those large buildings. I found again that there were many different smells and sounds that were included in any of these large metro areas. And each large urban city has different smells and sounds and lights and everything else, right? And so I loved going around the world and kind of learning about some of these different places. And in fact, what I would do when I would travel is, yeah, I'd go to some of the tourist areas and I'd go down to some of those places. But then what I really enjoyed was walking down the alleyways and out there at night when nobody was there, or kind of off the beaten path, and actually seeing how real people lived, because that was a big part of my, overall education as well, in understanding and learning how people in different parts of the world, what they believe, how they live, how we're the same in a lot of ways, and even how we're different in other ways. And so I kind of tried to encapsulate that somewhat into this poem as well, right? And the fact that here I was, and I was alone, I was by myself, but I don't mind solitude. I still don't mind solitude. In fact, sometimes I need solitude, right? I left the big city to go back to the country, right? Away from people more, maybe similar to the longing of Sam McGee, that we talked about before, that served me for a portion of my life, and then it didn't. And then I needed to move on, right? And again, another reminder that we all have cycles. We all have different things in our life, right? The old song that comes from the Bible, if it's in Psalms or where it is, to everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, 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 right? And so there's seasons of our life. There's different things that we're going through, right? There's certain things that we process and we become somebody new within our life. And so I've seen that. And again, kind of going back and looking at this book now and seeing some of the poems that I wrote, and maybe I'll share more with you on other episodes as well. But for me as well, to be able to stop and kind of turn around and look backwards in my life and go, whoa, you know what? From 1990 until today, which is 2024, right? 34 years, I am the same, but a much different person than I was back then. I've learned a lot. I've seen a lot. I've smelled a lot, right? I've met a lot of people over that time. And over that time, I have evolved and moved into other phases of my journey, right? Which again is what we're all going through. Our life is like the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell talked about and many people talk about, right? Where we go out on our quest and we are taught, by others, usually by a sage or a teacher, right? That helps us go through this, but that we have to still kind of go through all these things on our own. So anyway, that's what I kind of got for today, was talking about poetry, sharing a little bit about my poetry, the cremation of Sam McGee. I hope you enjoyed that. And I might do some more of this as well, because I think poetry is a somewhat lost art form. I think there used to be a lot more poetry written than there is today. People used to read poetry a lot more. Now people listen to songs. And again, some songs and the lyrics behind them are better than others. Some are kind of mindless jabbering, and don't even make any kind of coherent sense, not even not even abstract kind of a thing. And I think that's too why I'm drawn to certain musical artists who are also either great lyricists who have written the song, or that use great lyrics from somebody else, whoever wrote the song behind it. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and shut off for this video, but thanks for watching. And you can find more videos like this on my YouTube channel as well, obviously, with the Jamming with Jason podcast. So go out and have a great week. And hey, maybe read a little bit of poetry this week and find something that calls to you. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thanks.